everybody. This is Silvio Canto in Dallas, Texas on Sunday, May 21st. As we like to do on Sundays, we'll be chatting with our good friend Bill Katz, the editor of Urgent Agenda. We've got a lot of agenda to get to today, as you can imagine. President Trump is in Saudi Arabia. What I saw today was actually very good. I'm anxious to hear what Bill has to say about it. But what I saw was very good. I thought the language was good. I thought the idea that, hey, you know, we're back in the game, but at the same time, you people need to fix some of your own problems. I thought that message was very timely. Trump, there's an independent counsel, as you well know. His name is Robert Mueller, and that's going to be interesting because I actually think Mueller could end up helping President Trump a great deal. So we'll see how that develops. The media and leaks, this is really beginning to get awfully ugly, where you have people within the government leaking to the media, and they're doing it because they want to embarrass President Trump, and I don't think that's good for the country. I really don't. We'll talk a little bit about that tonight. Speaking of the media, there's a news report that came out, or a poll, or some kind of a study that came out indicating just how biased the media coverage of Mr. Trump has been. Something like 93% of the stories have been negative. It's hard to call that journalism when you're that one-sided in your negativity. That's not journalism as far as I'm concerned. And Vice President Pence was in Notre Dame today, and some students did walk out, but for the most part, most of the students listened and behaved correctly, and I thought it was a great victory for free speech today at Notre Dame, in contrast to what we have seen in other parts of the country. Let's say hello to Bill Katz, the editor of Urgent Agenda. How are you, Bill?
I'm just fine, Silvio. A very beautiful day here in New York. Watching the news, we actually had to cut out a little bit of Urgent Agenda this week on one day because there was so much news that I couldn't keep up with it. You know, you have to research it first before you write about it, and it just got to the point where it was just too much. I am here practicing my sword dances, and having seen the president do a sword dance, I thought I would do a sword dance too. You know, one of the things that I think many people did not notice in this trip to Saudi Arabia, I saw it several times. Melania Trump was with the president, the first lady, and she engaged in conversation with Saudi men, but not once did I see a Saudi man look at her directly.
Interesting.
They spoke to her, but their line of sight was slightly off, and I guess that's a cultural tradition.
It is, because if you remember during that speech, there were very few women in that room. I mean, I think there were a couple of heads of state maybe from Africa, but other than that, I mean, you can count them with your fingers. You had Mrs. Trump, you had Ivanka Trump, and that's about it. I mean, and it's interesting to me because we're so accustomed to seeing the heads of state with their wives, you know, the first lady of whatever country, and to go to a place that sort of reminds me of my old Catholic school where it was all boys. It's a little different from what it used to be, Bill.
Yeah. Well, yes, very, very true. It was, as I said at the blog, we shouldn't have any illusions as to who we're dealing with. Saudi Arabia is not our kind of country. It's not a democracy. Women are treated badly. The court system is also archaic. But they are making a little bit of progress, and I think that just as in any period in history, you have to deal with people you don't like. That doesn't mean you have to go along with what they do, but if the president can move Saudi Arabia more in our direction and away from the craziness that they have taught over the years. After all, 15 of the 19 hijackers on 9/11 came from Saudi Arabia. But they have seemed to have moderated since. I don't know if it's sincere. I don't know if it will continue. But every little bit helps. I thought it was a brilliant stroke to have all those leaders from Muslim countries in the same room so he could speak to them directly. Now, I watched some of the coverage on television. I was shocked, by the way, that some of the networks did not run his speech live. The cable systems did, CNN and Fox. But you watched CBS, and I don't know if it's also true of NBC. I mean, there was a time in American television where a speech like that would be covered live on every network. And here were they were just doing their business as usual stuff. I don't know if that would have happened with Obama. I don't think so. I think he would have been covered live. But this was one of the most important speeches an American president has made in recent years. And let's see what comes of it. A good speech and a good visit do not make results. Let's see what the results are. From what I understand, after the speech, it got a pretty good reception, but there were some people who said, your problems are in Europe, they're not with us. One Arab delegate said, no, it's all about the Arab-Israeli conflict. So this is not going to be 100% reception. But the Saudis treated him very graciously, I'm sure for entirely self-interest reasons. And that's fine. I don't care about self-interest as long as they do the things that we want them to do. Now, one of the things that is going to grow controversial is this enormous arms deal. And the Israelis are not overly pleased with this. They were not consulted on it beforehand, which is wrong. In addition, you have, I'm going to sneeze. No, I'm not going to sneeze.
Well, it must be the allergies in New Yorkville. That's what it is. All these allergies in New York. I mean, we have them here in Dallas like crazy too. So it's allergies.
Well, I turned down my air purifier when we're on the air because it makes noise. But I was going to say I want to see the fine print on the arms deal because, as I understand it, there are 140 helicopters that are going to be built under this plan in Saudi Arabia. That is not something we should have agreed to. The idea is to bring the jobs back here. And I think there may be elements of this plan that will raise some congressional opposition. The key point will be results. Will there be any results? We have tried Arab unity before as a strategy, bringing Arab countries together. It has never worked particularly well. It might work better this time. Now, the president did not go to Egypt, which is culturally the most important Arab country, on this trip, but he did indicate he's going to go in the future. The acid test is tomorrow in Israel, and that is whether he can make any progress on the Arab-Israeli peace front and whether he can maintain the kind of commitment to Israel that is necessary to permit Israel to feel comfortable to make concessions in that peace process. He was doing rather well, but in the last few weeks there were some real missteps between the United States and Israel. The president giving apparently classified information from Israel to Russia, and apparently the Israelis are livid over it, and properly so. That's something you're not supposed to do. The bad behavior of an American diplomat in preparing the trips, some other signals that have upset the Israelis, they don't necessarily mean anything. Let's see what President Trump does in Israel. He will also be going to Ramallah to talk to Abbas, and he has got to lay down the law to Abbas that there is an Arab world now willing to engage in a thoughtful process of peace with Israel and come to an agreement. And Abbas and his friends in the Palestinian Authority have got to get on that train. And if they don't on that train, I think they may think they can stop the whole thing. I think what will happen is they'll just be ignored.
That's right.
So
of course he's got
the trip isn't over.
Right, and he's got the Vatican coming up, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But I thought it was very interesting. I was watching an analysis by Newt Gingrich before the speech, where Newt Gingrich was saying that Saudi Arabia is maybe beginning to realize that this problem of terrorism is a much bigger threat to them than, let's say, they thought before. And, they've got this problem right there, and so they're starting to take it more seriously, and some of these other governments are taking it more seriously because this is happening in their neighborhood. Now, the military deal, the way I understood the military deal, certainly the way that at least it was presented was that these were all jobs in the United States. And if that was the case, I thought, well, that's a good deal for American companies. But if we're going to be making them in Saudi Arabia, well, that's
not a good deal. The only people who benefit will be
deal.
The shareholders and the executives, which is
exactly rather than some of the companies in Texas or Seattle where they make these things, Bill.
Yeah, we'll have to see what the fine print is on these and when the process actually starts. The Saudi regime could be overthrown in 2 years. Who knows? It's a very unstable part of the world. But let's see the trip, the visit tomorrow to Israel. Of course, it's already the CNN reporters are pumping up the Palestinian end of it, and one of the CNN reporters was just on television, just obnoxious and just saying, well, this president doesn't understand the way people live. After all, he didn't travel very much. He may have been in hotel rooms making deals, but he didn't see the people, as if somebody has to tell President Trump that there are people who live there. I mean, it's just what a demeaning attitude some of these reporters have.
Well, I wonder if they used to say the same thing about. I wonder if they used to say the same thing about Obama, who had never really been outside. You know, Obama, when he went over there, he was like, God walking on water, and even though he had technically less experience, even less international experience than President Trump does. I mean,
much less.
As a businessman, Trump traveled quite a bit and made quite a few trips and visited with many heads of state, and yet. But I want to talk about CNN in just a few minutes, Bill, because they've become almost it's beyond journalism. When your negative is that coverage, I mean, when your coverage is that negative, you're not a journalist anymore. You're something else, not really journalism. But I do want to make one more point, Bill. I don't know if you saw the same thing that I did in this trip, or the way that President Trump was treated by Saudi Arabia. It's clear to me that Saudi Arabia, for whatever reason, and they've got their own self-interest, I'm sure, but for whatever reason, they are much happier with President Trump than they were with President Obama. And just the way that he was welcomed, the king actually went to the airport to greet the President of the United States, something that he didn't do for President Obama. And just the sheer elegance and the sheer size of the welcome, clearly, the Saudi Arabians were sending a message, Bill. At least they sent it to me. I don't know if you had the same reaction.
No, I did. They like decisive, strong leadership. Osama bin Laden, who I don't usually quote, but he said something that was absolutely true about the Middle East. He said, it's the strong horse who wins. And Trump comes across as a leader, and he comes across as a strong president. Obama came across as kind of a flaky, weak guy with a Muslim background, to be sure, but he thought that guaranteed him some entree into the Arab world. Well, it may have, but in 2009, his first year in office, when the people of Iran revolted and there was a chance of overthrowing the Iranian government, the President of the United States was nowhere to be seen. And I think that stunned many of the Sunni Arab countries, which are our natural allies, and they said, what kind of a guy is this? Well, they found out later he was a weak guy. And the fact that he had some quibbles with Netanyahu meant nothing to them. He was a weak guy. When it came to Syria, he drew a red line in the sand, and then he busted all up and stepped right over it. And now you have a president who seems to be a strong guy.
Right.
Now we will see. And also, by the way, the Saudis apparently have now volunteered to help with an Arab-Israeli settlement, which is in their interest. So let's see what happens. The trip isn't over. He has to go to Israel. He has to go to the Vatican. Then he goes to the G7 in Sicily, and I think to Belgium. Let's see what happens for the rest of the trip. One of the things that will dog him is, and you just mentioned CNN, is that the press is still continuing to talk about these controversies in the United States, which I don't think Americans have all that much interest in, but the press has an interest in it. Now, look at a year from now, if in fact two things happen. One, if he is cleared by the FBI investigation, that there was no collusion with Russia, and if he can pull off even the beginning of a settlement between the Arabs and the Israelis, he's going to look like a very different president than he looks like today, and the journalists are going to look like fools.
That's right. Well, they're looking like fools already, I think. But to me, the contrast, with President Obama was remarkable, and I think that many of these people, like you say, they see President Obama as the man who pulled out of Iraq and left the whole vacuum there for ISIS. Then you had the weakness with the red line in Syria. But I think something else too, Bill. I don't know if you saw the same thing, but it looks to me like when they don't like the fact that Iran got as powerful as it did under President Obama. I think they fear Iran more than anything else. And I think they were saying, hey, we don't like this appeasement of Iran that made Iran a bigger threat to all of us than it was before under President Bush, Bill.
Yes, that I think is absolutely true. And I think another thing that worries them is that under Barack Obama, or as we call him at the Urgent Agenda, Field Marshal Obama, the Russians moved back into the Middle East. And that is not necessarily good news for them, because the Russians moved back in as an ally of Iran. And the Saudis already fear Iran, and now they have an Iran with Russia behind it. And they attribute this, I think, to the weakness of President Obama. So yes, I think that there is a chance here, for some progress on our part in the Sunni Muslim world, as long as we keep it in proportion and we don't sell out other allies. And remember also, the president is returning to the Middle East to go to Egypt, which Obama shunned because there was a coup against the freely elected member, a guy from the Muslim Brotherhood. And somebody said it was kind of a soft coup because the people had gotten tired of him anyway. But Obama was rather sympathetic to the Muslim Brotherhood. So the Egyptians have now warmed to the United States. All around a good thing as long as we don't sell out the Israelis. I don't think we will. I think Trump has enough common sense not to. What I'm looking for tomorrow is some progress on the Arab-Israeli peace front in Israel and with the Palestinians, but I'm also looking for words of reassurance to the Israelis. What they're going to need to make a peace agreement is some kind of formal security pact, whether it's with the United States alone or with NATO or something involving other countries. I don't know. But I think there is a deal to be had there if President Trump can talk sense to the Palestinians, because they're now out of step with the rest of the Arab world. They're still taking this tough, we'll never recognize you line, and that's never going to work. They're going to have to. Both sides are going to have to make concessions.
Right. Well, I think you're exactly right, but we'll see how it happens. But the fact that there were so many leaders and heads of state in that room listening to President Trump, and I saw the president of Egypt, attentively listening to President Trump. He clearly was happy with what he was hearing. But I do think it was interesting. Some of the critics of the president were already saying, well, during the campaign, he called the Iraq War stupid, and he called everything stupid, and now, he's talking about sending troops in. I didn't hear today, Bill, that President Trump wants to send troops in. I mean, I didn't always agree. I mean, I didn't always agree with everything he said during the campaign. I thought he went too far in some of the criticism of the Iraq War. But what I heard today was that we're back, but you guys are going to have to clean your own home because we can't do that for you, Bill. That's
exactly what he was saying, and I think that was a good message. He did not use the phrase Islamic terrorism, at least to the best of my knowledge. There were several drafts of the speech that have been published, but he did make clear that it was within Islam and that they have a problem and they have to be the primary people to solve it. And I thought it was just an extraordinary day to have that happen. Now, the difference between him and Obama coming to the Middle East is that Obama came to the Middle East and delivered his famous 2009 speech in Cairo, and it was kind of an apology for the United States. And the fact of the matter is that the Arab world did not respect him for that. Again, it's the strong horse. He appeared weak. And to go in and all these obsequious statements and got the history of Israel all wrong, they didn't come away loving him. They would rather have a strong ally who occasionally makes foolish comments than a weak ally who is politically correct. They're hard-boiled, and if the trip works out the way that Trump wishes, Henry Kissinger said he could be a considerable president, and yes, he could be a considerable president. If he should pull off an Arab-Israeli agreement and be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, I would love to see CNN the next day.
That's Yes, I think they may go out of business the next day and just pull the plug if that were to happen, and not do any transmissions for 24 hours. That would be very interesting to watch. We're going to take a little break, Bill. When we come back, I've got a couple more thoughts about the trip, and then we'll get into the special prosecutor or special counsel, Robert Mueller. We'll be right back. This is Silvio Canto in Dallas, Texas. We're talking to our good friend Bill Katz, the editor of Urgent Agenda. Bill, getting back to the trip for a second, I wanted to put a little exclamation point here for a couple of my friends, Leslie Eastman and Barry Jacobson. Leslie writes for Legal Insurrection, and Barry has a military. Yeah, Barry has a military blog, and a couple of years ago, I had them on the show, and they were talking about the idea of creating like a Middle East NATO, if you will, like a military army to fight terrorism and so on. And maybe Mr. Trump has the same idea in what he was proposing, Bill.
Well, that's the term that's come down to us, the Middle East NATO. However, NATO is a particular alliance with particular rules, and I don't know if the Arab world being split between Sunni and Sunni and forgot the other one, but being split politically along a number of lines. I don't know if that's the analogy I would use. I'm not so sure that anything that is equivalent to NATO would last. There is a Gulf Cooperation Council that is set up with the Gulf nations. That I think is more or less an economic entity. But however it's set up, I don't care what the setup is, as long as it works and works in our favor.
Right. Well, I think hopefully it works better than NATO, in the sense that more countries actually pay their share.
Well, that's one of the problems with NATO.
Yeah. In the case of NATO, we have this big organization, and other than the United States and the UK and the Canadians who sent Marines to Afghanistan, it doesn't really get much bigger than that. But I thought it was overall a good trip. But as you say, we have to wait for the next chapter, which is Israel, and then the Vatican. I don't expect the Vatican to be that consequential, but it's always important to meet the Pope. I guess that's all I would say. I really don't expect the Pope to be, I just don't see anything major coming out of that other than, well, you got to see the Pope, I guess, if you're the President of the United States at some time.
Well, yes, and look, they'll make these nice statements. Trump will make statements about the importance of Catholicism. He'll find a Catholic relative somewhere to talk about. The Pope will make a statement, probably in Latin, about the importance of being kind to refugees, and they'll say goodbye to each other and probably never see each other again. But as you said, you got to see the Pope. That's
well,
but
maybe
very,
Melania will read the statement in Latin. I understand she speaks
that's
5
right.
languages. So that's
right. And there are popes who do have international influence, and John Paul II truly had international influence, and he was one of the great popes of the last century. John the 23rd was another one, who do have international influence. This pope seems to have not too much influence. Why that is, we can have a long discussion. But it really, I think, depends a lot on the tempo of the times.
Right, and you're right. John Paul came from Poland at a time when the Soviet Union was collapsing in the 1980s, so he was almost perfect for the times. But I think this particular pope, while we're happy that he came from Latin America, I'm still, sometimes his knowledge of economics worries me. And, he doesn't seem to grasp how wealth is created and how prosperity is created. But we're working on him, Bill. We Catholics are working on the Pope. Hopefully he will he will say something different in a few years. But overall, I think so far it's been a good trip, and hopefully it continues that way. But let's talk, if I may just quickly jump to CNN, because we've made a couple of references. There was a news story that came out about the negativity in the media, and something like 93%. Now, I don't know if they were talking about CNN, but some of the other networks. Bill, when you have, you worked at the New York Times, you know the media better than I do. But when you have that level, and by the way, this is a study by Harvard. This was not a study by Rush Limbaugh. This was a study by Harvard. When you have that level of negativity, I have a hard time calling that journalism. I think that's something other than journalism, Bill.
Well, it is, but it reflects what might be called the new journalism, and that was something that started to develop in the 1960s. We had a development in journalism before that. Several phases of the history of American journalism. In the 1800s, especially the late 1800s, when journalism really started to develop, it was not uncommon for newspapers to be linked with a political party. In fact, it was the norm. And in the early 20th century, people like Joseph Pulitzer tried to pull away from that and to make the distinction that became the goal later on in that century of a newspaper that had neutrality on its news pages and opinion on its editorial pages. Later in the century, under the tutelage of a man I worked for directly at the New York Times, Lester Markell, interpretive journalism was developed, and that was kind of a mix that you could put on news pages interpretations of a story, what they meant, what the significance was, as long as you didn't express a political opinion. And Markell, who, as I said, initiated that, always knew it was dangerous. You could drift very easily into opinion. I think what happened in the 1960s, for a variety of reasons, was a kind of journalism that held that there is something higher than the individual story, a greater cause, a greater story, and it's up to us to tell it. Well, then you're getting into really dangerous territory, because what's the higher story? That's a matter of opinion. And the news pages increasingly became laced with opinion, and I think that the low watermark of that, the low watermark ultimately was the 2008 presidential election, which was practically handed to Obama by the American press. There was no real journalism. There was no vetting of this man. There were no serious questions. They had decided this is the guy we want, and that's it. And they got what they wanted. And it's gotten much worse since.
They sure did.
Yes.
Well, I mean, you remember this morning I was watching, there was a discussion about this, and one of the journalists was saying that, journalists are very curious, and when they see a pattern of behavior, they get more curious. I mean, he was talking about the leaks and President Trump, and I kept asking myself, that may be true, but that was certainly not true under President Obama. I mean, I don't remember any curiosity at all about whether it was Benghazi or Fast and Furious or the IRS scandal or anything like that. No curiosity in any of these stories. And I think the reason the media is so disregarded, Bill, is because a lot of people understand the bias, and they realize that they're treating President Trump differently than they treated President Obama, and I think that's why there's so much anger at the media. It's not that people dislike an aggressive media. I do. I like an aggressive media. But I think when they see the contrast, they go, wait a minute, this is not a fair game here, Bill.
That's correct. And, they were brought up in a generation where you were told to speak truth to power. I love that phrase, speak truth to power. If I ever hear anybody say that, my first question is, how do you know you have the truth? That's where the first question should be. But they have increasingly become a profession that believes that its primary responsibility is to make a difference, not to report the news. No, their primary responsibility should be to report the news. Now, that does not mean you can't do investigative journalism of outrages in society. That's fine, but they have to be reported accurately, not just somebody's opinion or selective facts that seem to back up a political opinion or a political stance. The press simply decided it didn't want Donald Trump to be president. That's fine with me. I don't care what they decided, as long as they report the news, keep their editorials on the editorial page, but that's not what we're seeing.
No, and now you have the situation with the leaks, Bill, where you have reporters who obviously know that they're getting leaks to hurt the president, and they go on with them. That really bothers me. I just don't think that's, I mean, I think the reporters should say, no, I'm not going to print that because this hurts the country. And they don't seem to be doing that, Bill.
That's correct. The leaks are very dangerous to the country. First of all, other countries won't trust us. They won't trust us because they'll think things will be leaked to the press that originated with them, and that happened just recently. And there is also going to be a lack of respect and belief in the United States government by the American people. If the government leaks like this, if a president cannot do his work because everything he says winds up on the front page of the New York Times the next day, I think the American people will become very discouraged and very frustrated, and I hope very angry.
Yes, and I think so. Like the story, for example, with Comey, and and this memo that the reporter never actually had in his hand, but somebody read it to him over the phone. Bill, I think that's pretty bad journalism. I mean, it seems to me that if you cannot actually get your hands on the memo and actually see it for yourself, I don't know. You worked at the New York Times. Do you think a story like that would have made the pages back then?
It would have if the source was absolutely reliable. In other words, if it was somebody who the Times had used before and had always been proved accurate. But when when you're dealing with documents can be very funny. People are defending Comey and saying, well, he contemporaneously wrote this memo. Well, whoop-de-doo. I mean, what does that mean? How do we know that memo actually reflected what happened? People write self-serving things all the time and put them into files. It's a very, very common practice in Washington and elsewhere. So we don't know if that's what Trump said. And since they were the only two people in the room, there's really no way to check it out. But yet it was run as gospel that this is what the director of the FBI wrote contemporaneously the next day. Now we're being told by CNN, exclusively apparently, that Comey at the time did not believe that Trump was trying to influence him, but has since evolved. I love that word, evolved. His opinion has evolved, and now he believes that Trump was trying to influence him. Well, this is a man who was just fired. And if he thinks anyone's going to take him seriously on an evolution, I've evolved since the day I was fired, and I now realize that he was trying to influence me. This is an important point because if Comey at the time thought that Trump was trying to influence him, he had an absolute legal obligation to go to the Justice Department and report it, which he didn't do. So I guess in testimony he'll have to explain why he didn't think then Trump was trying to influence him, but thought it since he got fired. It's almost a farce. It really is, It
is, and it's interesting, that CNN story that you're talking about, they say that a source familiar with his thinking, speaking of Mr. Comey, a source familiar with his thinking said that, that Mr. Comey thought that the president was trying to influence him. A source familiar with his thinking? So what do we have? People reading minds now, Bill? I mean, that's pretty crazy.
We have people reading minds and reading feelings, which is so typical of that generation. We're going to read, we understand your feelings, we feel your pain. Look, Comey is not going to be a very good witness, I don't think, for any side, because he has now been dismissed. And once a person has been dismissed, you assume he is prejudiced toward the person who dismissed him. But it'll be interesting television. The people will run home and watch it. But I think that unless the special prosecutor or special counsel, the former director of the FBI, Bob Mueller, comes up with something reasonably fast, that this whole investigation may just collapse. And people are going to say, it's been how many months, and you haven't been able to come up with one thing? He might come up with a few things. He might come up with a few technical violations or very small violations, but I would really be shocked if he comes up with anything big.
Right. Well, I actually think, it was Alan Dershowitz who said that he thought this would actually help President Trump, and I actually agree with that because I don't see any collusion with Russia, but if Mr. Mueller decides to go after the unmasking of U.S. citizens or the leaks, this is one of those things that Democrats may regret. It's like the 51 votes in the Senate. They came to regret that. Yes. They may come to regret this thing. this thing very much. I actually like Mr. Mueller, Robert Mueller. I think he's a decent guy. I really don't think that he's a partisan guy, and I'm willing to trust him at the moment. But I agree with you. He's got to shut this down very quickly, or otherwise it'll start getting very partisan. But who's going to tell the Democrats, Bill? Who's going to tell them that there's no Russia collusion? That's like that's going to be pretty hard to do when you have a base totally invested in that idea, Bill.
That's right. Well, if Mueller finds nothing, the Democrats the next day, you may be sure, will say, well, he was, he's a government guy, and what we really need is an outside commission. And they're going to say, well, we shouldn't stop here. We should have an outside commission. Maybe they could bring in some of the late-night talk show hosts to head it, and we can have not only an investigation but jokes at the same time. And they want this to go on and on and on and on. And, of course, there are plenty of journalists.
That's right. They can bring Ellen. She can be the special counsel. This lady Ellen who's got the TV show.
Ellen DeGeneres, yes.
That's right. She can be the special counsel, and this thing will go on. But I actually, when Mueller was appointed, Bill, I actually thought it would turn out well for President Trump because he's lowered the volume, because now people cannot say anything about it, and President Trump can concentrate on other things. I just hope that President Trump understands the opportunity he's been given. I hope he understands that this is a great moment for him to stop tweeting and start talking about the world and jobs and stop saying that this is a witch hunt and all of that. I just don't think that helps him, Bill.
I don't think it helps him either. He ought to just ignore it, and he ought to also. Now, one idea that has been brought forth by Newt Gingrich is to abolish the regular press conferences at the White House. I'd have no problem with that because they never seem to result in any news anyway. It seems to be a demonstration by the reporters that they're doing their jobs and they deserve a salary increase. But I don't see any great stuff coming out. And also, you can have a situation where the president holds a news conference, maybe about something very important, maybe some strategic breakthrough in the Middle East or something, and the reporters won't ask anything about that and ask only about the scandal. And that could really cause a moment of contempt for the journalistic profession on the part of the American people, and they should be careful of it.
Well, during the Obama years, these special, press conferences or wherever were pretty much worthless, with the exception of a couple of people. Nobody really asked any questions, and now it seems like they've all decided to be journalists at the moment, and they're all asking all of these questions. I don't know whether I'm ready to do away with them, Bill, but maybe they can be 3 times a week or something like that. Another idea that somebody came up with, I don't know if I read this, I don't remember if I read this at Urgent Agenda or somewhere else, but that maybe they should take more calls directly from the American people. Have 4 or 5 Americans call in some questions just to kind of remind the media what in fact people are talking about. A couple of things. One thing I wanted to bring up regarding your city of New York and this demonstration that included will include, I guess, the Puerto Rican terrorist Lopez Rivera. I am so happy that of the reaction that we've had in New York, where Goya Foods has pulled out and many other sponsors have pulled out. That is
and
delightful.
And the Hispanic
Bill.
police officers.
Yes, that is
Hispanic
delightful.
Police Officer Association has also.
That's right.
Out.
And I think that's wonderful that this is the reaction that the mayor and some of these left-wingers are getting. It's obvious to me that they have a total insensitivity to the police. These are the same people who get all bent out of shape if a kid in a college dresses as a taco for Halloween, but yet they don't seem to care about the police, Bill.
That's right. Well, the person who has instigated this is the president of the city council, whose name I forget, but she is some piece of work. She is a Puerto Rican nationalist. She was born in Puerto Rico. She was a fan of FALN. She actually declared that FALN never killed anybody, when in fact many people went to prison for just that, murder. She is a fan of the guy who has just been released, who was an FALN operative and was sent to prison for, I think, 70 years. And then President Obama pardoned him. which was an outrageous act, very controversial here. And not only was he released from prison, but the president of the city council went to Puerto Rico to greet him after he was released from prison. I mean, that's how extreme this woman is. And she's the one behind this. And instead of being gracious in the face of all the opposition, which is righteous opposition, she doubled down and said, no, we're going to do this, and I urge other people to join in. I hope that other people don't join in, and that the parade either has to be canceled or the guy will walk down, will be the Grand Marshal, and there'll be nobody watching. But it's an insult to Puerto Rico. It's an insult to the Hispanic police officers who was, I just pointed out, have now refused to participate in the parade. It's an insult to the American flag. But that's who this woman is. I think she's leaving the presidency of the city council, and none too soon.
Right. Now, where's the mayor in all of this, Bill? Is he? I'm assuming he's a pretty lefty guy, but where is he in this?
You know, I don't know if he has actually issued a statement. I know that the governor has issued a statement saying he has to study the matter. I mean, he's caught between a rock and a hard place. He has a very large Hispanic constituency, and yet on the other hand, he doesn't really want to antagonize the great majority of the people. Also, there's an assumption on the part of some that Hispanics would necessarily side with this guy, this terrorist. That's not true at all, as the Hispanic Police Officers Association showed when it pulled out in protest against honoring this former terrorist. So
well,
it'll be a very, very... Yes, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I was going to say, Bill, not only the Hispanic officers, but Goya Food, that is one of the biggest Hispanic companies in the whole country. It's a major player in the New York, New Jersey area, and that they would pull out, that they must have been speaking for lots and lots of employees of Goya who said, we don't like this at all, Bill.
I think that's true, and I think there are these elements of courage that we've seen. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't recall when the parade is. I don't remember what the date of it is. But it should be a very, very tense moment in New York if they continue to honor this guy.
I hope so, because I was personally very offended, and several Puerto Rican friends of mine were also very offended. Something else that happened today, Bill, Vice President Pence spoke at Notre Dame and actually gave a very good speech, and it was very interesting because something like 150 students got up, but they were a very, very small percentage of the overall graduating class. And I think that, to me, maybe this was a turning point in this whole thing with colleges, where students are saying, we're fed up with all of these political clowns, who want to walk out and make noise. Don't come to the graduation if you don't like the speaker, Bill.
That's true. And also remember that these people who are making the noise are interrupting other students who may have decided we don't want to be interrupted anymore. And so I think I'm hoping it was an important moment. I'm not sure it is, because these students, the ones who cause the disruptions, usually don't go to schools like Notre Dame. They go to these elite, so-called elite colleges, and I think that they will continue at the elite colleges, but I think maybe there is now some pushback there as well.
Well, I hope so, because I think that when the Vice President of the United States comes to your graduation, that should be a moment of happiness, not a moment to play politics. And I thought Pence was great in his speech, and I thought those students, very few of them, but nevertheless, they made fools out of themselves. We're going to take a little break. We'll be back with one more segment with Bill right after this. This is Silvio Canto in Dallas, Texas. One more segment tonight with our friend Bill Katz, the editor of Urgent Agenda. Bill, you had an interesting post this afternoon about members of Congress, GOP members of Congress, concerned about their safety when they go back to their districts. See, I don't think that those are voters, Bill. I don't think that.
Neither do I.
When you have a district like some of these Freedom Caucus districts where the Republican is winning by 75-80%, and then you go to a meeting with your constituents and everybody's screaming, those are not voters. I'd be surprised I don't know whether you can check this or not, but this doesn't strike me. I should say it this way. I think this is all staged. That's what I'm saying, Bill.
Oh, yes. Oh, I think they are staged. I think they're organized. I think we've seen that in several cases. I think they represent possibly the fringe left of the Democratic Party and other parts of the fringe left. And I think they are probably making more enemies than friends. But they feel they want to shut down Republican congressmen. And some of the demonstrations have been very frightening. I also made a point at the blog today that this fear of violence has extended well beyond members of Congress. You see a fear of violence on college campuses. And in fact, last week at one of the California colleges, the college president, who was scheduled to meet with some minority students, shifted the place of the meeting because he felt unsafe, physically unsafe, in the first location. That's pretty serious when a college president is afraid of his own students.
Right. Where is California Governor Ronald Reagan when we really need him, Bill?
Oh, he was tough on this, and now they have they have the Governor Moonbeam is back, Governor Brown, who was actually governor in the 1970s and came back to be governor again. We also saw last night. This is quite remarkable. The meeting of the California Democratic Party, and they met in Sacramento. What happened was absolutely shocking. The chairman of the party started speaking in foul language, cursing. He then made an obscene gesture toward President Trump, and the audience responded with an obscene gesture. I have not seen that tape. I've seen it online. I have not seen it on any of the mainline or mainstream media outlets. Apparently, when Donald Trump does something obscene, and he did, it was broadcast all over, but when the California Democratic Party and its leaders engage in obscene behavior, that's not important enough for CNN.
That's right.
But this was disgraceful, and they have a national chairman now, the Democratic Party does, who gives speeches in which children are present, in which he uses obscene words. This is unheard of in American politics.
Right.
It's just unheard of.
It is.
And people talk about the possibility of Trump leaving or resigning or being impeached or something. I think the dream is for the Democrats to be so intense that they will gain back Congress next year. But the problem is they're not a governing party. They really aren't. They're a mess. They're in chaos. They have these very, very powerful fringe elements. And maybe they should kind of calm down and rebuild their party before they try to govern.
Well, I agree. And in order to pick up the House, they would have to get, I think, something like 24 seats, but they would have to win a lot of these, competitive districts. I don't see how you do that with a guy like Tom Perez. Unless he changes his act, I don't see how you do it. Bill, before we talk about next week, I just wanted to just do a quick reminder that this is the 90th anniversary of Charles Lindbergh. Obviously, I was not around back then. My own father was only a year old back then, but that had to be, I've always felt that must have been one of the most exciting moments in the history of the 20th century when this young man from Minnesota flew across the Atlantic. I know that later on he had some other controversies, but at least that one day, it must have been amazing to be alive and to hear that this guy flew all over the Atlantic, Bill. Well,
he flew solo. That was the main thing. He flew solo and nonstop between Long Island, New York, and Le Bourget Airport in France. And yes, it was incredibly dramatic. And people followed it on radio. We had no television then. And when it was flashed that Lindbergh had landed, he was called Lucky Lindy. He came back and was honored by the United States, honored by New York City. I believe he had a ticker-tape parade, but I'm not absolutely sure of that, and was for several years a hero. Then his life kind of descended into tragedy. His son was kidnapped and murdered, his little baby son, Charles Lindbergh Jr., and later on he unfortunately made some political choices that were regrettable. He seemed to sympathize with the Nazis. Later on, long after his death, it was revealed that he had a family in Germany. second family that his first family never knew about. He was an isolationist, an America Firster, and when World War II broke out, he volunteered for service, even though he had these rather pro-Nazi views. President Roosevelt despised him, but he did let him come into the military and go to the Pacific, not to Europe. And he did do some good advising, and I don't know what else he did during the war. After the war, he became something of an environmentalist, but his reputation was permanently tarnished. It never reached the level it was when he was an actual hero.
That's right. No, it was a very controversial life, but at least at that one moment, he was on top of the world. Looking at next week, Bill, obviously the presidential trip, what else would you be looking at next week?
Well, the presidential trip, the end of the presidential trip will occur at the end of the week. It's a very long trip, by the way, and that is very important. The results of the presidential trip, if there are any, and all these new leaks that seem to come out now every day regarding the investigation into the president and to whether his members of his campaign team colluded with the Russians. Those will be the stories. You know, we're getting into vacation time now. People will start going away. There are some other stories out there that are percolating, but I don't know if anything will be big on those stories this week. The North Koreans once again launched another missile in defiance of our demands that they stick to agreements. I don't know if anything will happen, though. The president has a lot on his plate this week. There may be other things. One of the things we ought to be looking at each week now is the pace and course of American journalism. American journalism is, as you pointed out from that Harvard study, it's way out there. It's really taking tremendous risks with its own future, and those risks may not work out. There may be a general public revulsion. So I think that those subjects will take up our time. There are always others. We are getting into warm weather, and I think that there may be a great concern that some of our cities may have some serious problems this summer, not simply for the usual reasons, but because agitators will want to embarrass the Trump administration as much as possible.
That's right, and that's exactly right. And they're very well. I mean, these agitators are well planned, as we see at these town hall meetings with members of Congress. So I think you're right. I think that's something to worry about. But as always, Bill, thank you for your time, and we look forward to our next chat. I'm sure there'll be a lot about the president's trip that we'll talk about, and we'll certainly follow the trip at Urgent Agenda. Thank you for the great work you do, and thank you for joining us on Sundays.
Great pleasure, and looking forward to next Sunday.
All right. Thank you so much. Bill Katz, the editor of Urgent Agenda. We talk with Bill every week. We do a week in review type program where we look at the big stories, and we get a lot of information from Bill. It's always a lot of fun for me to do this show. Thank you so much for listening. This is Silvio Canto in Dallas saying good night.